Ahoy Captain, and welcome to this masterclass on OPS, onshore power supply or shore power connections and pricing. We have poured almost 10 years of love, dedication and experience backed by data in order to give you an overview of shore power connections and infrastructure, as well as pricing benchmarks and models across EU ports. It is intended mostly for developers of shore power projects, but also for ship owners who want to know more about the pricing models, structure, and when you can compare it to burning fuel on board through your generators in order to generate electricity. But it's also just a way for you to learn more about the topic, about shore power in general, and how pricing is arranged and how it benchmarks with not just different ports but also ships. This masterclass is divided into 3 different sections. Feel free to skip to the parts that you like. The first part is about the onshore power supply or shore power infrastructure and the methodology that we use in order to define different projects, connections and prices. Secondly, of course, diving deeper into the results, the prices and the pricing models. Those are 2 different things. Then thirdly, we have the interactive database that you can use for your own project, and also the references we used in order for you to not only double check us, but use all the information we have for yourself. Before we dive into the topic, a few disclaimers from our part. Firstly, it is comprehensive but not complete. There's only so much information we can cram into half an hour, 45 minutes. And truth be told, some of the information is a bit in the eye of the beholder. We will explain to you many of the different ways of looking at the models, what to include, what not to include, and also our assumptions on the methodology. But for your instance or your project, things could be different. It is also ship type, but not ship specific. What we mean by that is we actually have different categories and ship types defined, as we will discuss, but it is not always 100% transferable to your specific ship. Probably there are exceptions because every ship is unique. Thirdly, it is very much subject to change. Actually, the information that you will see in this video is most likely already updated. We know for a fact that in some of the current updated models that you don't see in this video, which are only for the premium users, we have already included more and newer information. So it is constantly being updated, and of course that's part of our premium service that we provide those updates for you. And that said, it is an extra additional content for you to getting to know the topic, to explain our methodology. It is not the exact premium content. For that you have to become a member to download everything, or you have to buy the premium version yourself. And you can do it by signing up to the hub for all the premium features, downloads and support that you need. But without further ado, let's dive into the topic with section 1. About onshore power supply or shore power in general, and the methodology that we use in order to explain and also define different prices. And this is also the part where I have to be very careful because I do get carried away. But we will start with a short introduction about onshore power supply. What is it? Well, in brief, it is simply the following: bringing electricity from the shore to the ship. So it's grid-side electricity, and as you can see, we need sometimes quite elaborate machines or cable management system to get the power from the shore to the ship. But in all honesty, it is just that. Very complicated stuff, quite technical, but it's also simply taking a very big plug in some cases, for sure smaller ships of different plugs, but taking a very big plug and putting it inside the vessel so we can charge them and we can shut down the auxiliary generators which are providing electricity on board in normal cases. So these are the very big instances. There are also smaller instances. This is in Rotterdam, one of the projects I did with a smaller inland waterway ship on the right hand side, and here it is actually being powered by not just the grid but also a battery. So shore power comes in all shapes and sizes, not just the ships, but here we have a battery from Scone, which I also helped with, and another shore generator so that the onboard generator could be shut down and maintenance could be performed, and this was a setup for a few weeks in order to save emissions and also costs. But to provide power for some of the biggest ships available here, this is a pretty big ro-ro ship, but behind it you see a larger container or cruise ship. So the biggest vessels in the world need a lot of infrastructure. This is one of the most beautiful projects I've worked on, the shore power project of Hirama in the Calland Canal. And here you see different modules, and each module is actually a transformer that can provide up to 5 megawatts of power to the vessels, or actually 2 vessels simultaneously. So the person over there and the crane gives you a sense of the size that just for in some cases, and some cruise ships need even more, but you need quite a lot of infrastructure to just power 1 or 2 vessels. But again, ultimately shore power, like this example of another cruise ship, is simply plugging the ship into the grid on shore so that the ship itself can shut down its onboard generators in order to save emissions caused by the fuel combustion, noise, and hopefully a little bit of money, but that's all dependent on the price that we will discuss. Before we continue, we do need a little bit more technical details, especially about terminology, what we call what, because I've already used onshore power supply, OPS, shore power, some people call it cold anchoring, cold ironing. There's probably more ways of saying it. We typically say shore power, or if we don't have a lot of space, OPS. OPS is also used in some of the regulatory frameworks that we will see later on. So diving deeper into the technical basis, here is a schematic that we made. From left to right is how power flows from the grid to the ship. And in most, if not all, different frameworks, also the technical and the regulatory ones, we typically speak of a shore side and a ship side, with the cable management system in the middle, well, split. I usually adhere to whatever's on the vessel or the ship and floating with it or sailing away, that's the ship side, and whatever stays on the shore is the shore side. But for container ships with a different cable management system, which I will discuss shortly, there are different situation rules and you can deviate from them if needed. But let's just say whatever stays on shore is the shore side, whatever floats with the ship is the ship side. We start with the grid. That's typically where the power comes from, especially for longer term situations, not if you have a microgrid or a battery powered installation. And the grid in Europe is 50 Hz, and typically on a ship side it's 60 Hz, which can cause some challenges. Then power typically comes at a site or terminal through a substation, which is owned by the distribution system operator, typically the local, typically medium voltage onshore, but high voltage for the ship, but at least the local provider of the electricity network. And then power is brought from, it's not cut off, but then responsibility shifts from the DSO to the terminal owner. And then typically we have something called an E-house, or also a substation, or sometimes even a bus bar. There are many different ways of naming it. We typically call it an E-house. It's also typically owned, or at least situated at the terminal. It can consist of multiple houses even, or sometimes it's placed in different locations, but it almost always includes a transformer. And like I said, in EU we have 50 Hz frequency in our grid, and ships, most of them use 60 Hz. Typically also need in the EU a converter, and sometimes we also need 2 transformers if we have a pre-step up and a post-step down transformation, or vice versa. So we have the electrical equipment to get the right voltage and frequency and power, and also the power management system is typically either included in the E-house or somewhere else, but of course everything needs to be directed. Right power currents, the safety, the interlocks, etc. So that's what we call the E-house. Power is then I have to be careful, brought to the cable management system, also at the terminal side, and that's in quotes because for container ships the cable management system needs to be on board. So this is a bulk carrier, but if it was a container ship we'd have a cable management system on board, and typically what we use are little pits. Well, pit is one word, but shore pits. So it's like you open a hatch and there you can plug in the cable that is brought from the ship downwards to the quay side, which I still think is one of the most elegant solutions, but not all ships, almost none except for container ships, have those cable management. So this is what I would say a typical setup, yes, for most of the time. Now, these are also the terms that we will use mostly, and already some of the frameworks or the boxes have been put in place, but let's dive a little deeper into what's happening in the ship. So power is brought from the grid all the way into the connection panel on board the ship. So typically there's a hatch, as you saw, that's either opened or something else, and the cable is, together with the plug, brought into the connection panel. That needs to be a secure place, safe, so that you don't have high voltage, because you have typically high voltage risks. Then a shipboard transformer can be installed if the voltage coming in is different than the voltage used on board, which is many times the case. And then we also have the ship main switchboard, or also called bus bar, because if you look inside, there's just this typically a big copper plate, also in the E-house, and used in a bus bar is typically part of the switchboard itself. But the main switchboard is where the electricity is being divided all over the ship. So that's where we typically have to connect to if we want the ship to operate normally or under normal circumstances the same as it's operating with the auxiliary engines on. And those you see there. So what happens is the ship comes in, the cable is brought in, there's a lot of stuff going on, but at some point the auxiliary engines either need to be synchronized with the onshore grid, and the engines lowered, onshore grid brought up, and then there is a switch over. Or you could also choose just to shut down the auxiliary engines, everything turns black. By that they mean going through the black, or now I'm just mixing a Dutch saying with the original blackout, but at least you have a blackout of all electricity lost on board. You put the plug in, you turn on the switches, and you have lights on. So this is the technical basis. Now there is another thing that we need to discuss, and that has to do with not just the standards. Here we have the same schematic from the key shore power OPS standard, which is IEC IE 80005, 1, 2, and 3. And in there they speak of high voltage and low voltage. These are one of the key concepts in shore power, and we will discuss them. Well, mostly high voltage, that's our main interest, because lower voltage is typically technically easier, but also less costly and less subject to the regulations that we follow. But they remain very important to distinguish either way. So we have number 1, 80051 for high voltage, big ships, typically above a megawatt. And then we have number 3, low voltage, smaller ships, and that is below 1 megawatt, roughly. So typically we have from 1 megawatt onwards 6.9 and 11 kVs, kilovolts, both 50 and 60 hertz. That's defined in 80051, high voltage shore power systems, high voltage shore connection systems. And then we have LVSC, below 1 megawatt typically, and most ships, the standard describes 400, 440, 690 volts, and also. So the difference between those, and I have to look it up because it is stated in 80051 that it is expected that HVSC systems will have practical applications for ships requiring 1 MVA or more, or ships with high voltage main supply. So you can still choose what you want if you're at that split, and 1 MVA is not the same as, so 1 megavolt amps is not the same as 1 megawatt. It's actually, you always have less megawatts available than MVAs, but that's also quite technical and not needed here. Suffice it to say, there's already a benefit of using higher voltage connections because your cable will get lower. And what we see now typically is that in most bigger ports, unless you have very small ships, from even 500-600 kilowatts onwards, already high voltage 11 kV connections are being used. So we focus on the the HVSC systems for the most part, and the lower voltage systems to a lesser degree. Then there's also the question of what about them plugs? Yeah, This is a much debated discussion. Why? Because for some ships they have been defined and for some not, and this changes. So once you make a decision for a certain plug type, you also need the socket either on board or at the quayside, and then it's never permanent. I've actually seen people taking them off, changing it, putting new ones on, but that simply costs. So what we have is quite a lot of detail in different tools of ours that of course you can use, and members always. There are a few ship types that have specified plug and sockets geometry that have been defined in different standards. That is for high voltage, so these have been defined, but if your ship type or category is not in here, then you could have a challenge, because what do you have to do then? That's up to you and your verifier or class to decide. And for low voltage system, there are only 3 defined ships that have a defined socket and plug type. So here you see container ships have both, tankers are also defined for all, and then other ship types to a lesser degree. In my opinion, yes, it is sometimes tricky if you have non-defined ship type in the standard. However, in my opinion, it's also never really a technical problem, but more of a cost problem. And also, if you have a change of sockets and plugs, or you must change it at some point, yeah, that's of course going to impact your operation. And if you have something and you go to a different terminal where they use different sockets and plugs, yeah, that's not what you want. So there's always some synchronizing involved, but I've never experienced it as a showstopper per se. That's the introduction. That's all we need to know for now. That's the most important things to know and the terminology in order for us to continue. So then, why is this really important and why now? Because shore power systems have been in use for, well, I have to look it up, and Wikipedia knows better, but here in the Netherlands at least for 60 or 70 years, especially naval vessels or other vessels that want to cut down on engine hours, they have been using cold ironing or shore power for a very long time. So why is it becoming important now? Well, of course, emissions, noise, better life environment. This is taken from EMSA, which is the European Marine Safety Association. This is a very quick infographic of all the different rules and regulations currently being applied to shore power in order to drive down emissions from ships, but also noise. It's not just CO2 here, actually the CO2 or greenhouse gases in general coming from ships, depending on how you look at it, globally it's only 3%, the size of Germany, but it's not just greenhouse gas emissions, it's also particulate matters, sulfur, nitrogen oxides. There's a lot of other stuff, way worse locally, that you want to cut down on. And actually I did some of the calculations myself. I live in Rotterdam, I have 2 kids, and they smoke about 6 cigarettes a day. At least that was the last time I checked. Because of not just the ships, of course, but also the refineries here, there's a lot of emissions, particulate matters, and that translates almost directly into the smoking of a number of cigarettes per day. So there's a lot of health hazards accompanying emissions, and especially in big port areas, ships moored at the quayside. You want to cut down on those engine emissions, so you need to shut down the auxiliary engines on board. So especially FuelEU and those two are actually instating member states that they have to ensure or actually mandate the use of onshore power supply for ships. FuelEU is directed towards the ship owner. AFIR is mostly directed towards the port authorities. In other places in the world, there isn't much that I know of. I know in China there have been a lot of developments as far as I know, and they are working on a lot of electrification themselves. But for us, that's not yet our niche. But we do know that the ocean-going vessels at berth in California is also one of the driving metrics for shore power uptake, especially for tankers there that are moored at the Los Angeles berths. So why now? This is already here, but from 2030 onwards, across the EU, container ships and passenger ships, according to FuelEU, must be electrified at berth. Arise, but they have to have shore power, and 90% of all port calls, specific port calls in specific ports, have to be also electrified as per AFIR. So those are the directives and regulations that making it mandatory for ship owners. The EU, California, East Side Pacific is also working or already has a lot of these rules implemented, and these lead hopefully to the fact that more ships will have OPS abilities and more uptake will arise, and everybody can smoke less cigarettes. I'll smoke less cigarettes, less emissions locally, particularly. This is all nice and dandy, but none of these, of course, mention prices. So we have the technical framework, we have the legal, regulatory framework. There is no pricing framework. I've been working on shore power for 10 years. I know how to make a business case and a deal, but it can be very, very tricky. Before we go down that road with prices, however, there is one thing we have to discuss. What is a shore power connection? Because, ladies and gentlemen, it might be harder than you think. Here we have a few of them pictures again. So is the connection actually the plug? Is it one? Because if we have a ship like the top one, the cruise ships, they have 4 plugs actually. So is that 4 connections or is that 1 connection? What about a ship with actually 2 different entry ports? Haven't seen them yet, but could be done. And what about that installation? Is that 1 installation? But if it's having 2 ships at the same time, is it then maybe 2 installations? How does that work? Well, these were one of the problems we encountered when taking stock of all the onshore infrastructure for shore power connections. So we have defined it as the following. We start at the bottom, what we call the atomic point. 1 OPS connection is defined as 1 ship connected. So it can be 4 plugs, it can be 400 plugs. 1 ship connected is 1 connection point. From this definition, our database, our infrastructure, and also our prices are defined. So let me show you our methodology, or actually how we build up that different layered framework. This is it as it is in the guide. The guide I will show you later, but we have 5 layers, and we start with a single physical OPS connector or multiple plugs, but we call it a single OPS connection point or connector. Then the electrical installation feeding it, which is the small house that you saw with 4 transformers. That's the substation or the E-house, depending on your terminology, but that's where all the ships are connected to. And then we go to layer 3, which is the terminal or the zone or the quayside, or at least the place where the infrastructure is standing. You can have multiple E-houses or multiple houses or electrical infrastructure, but it's basically the fence around which the ships that are mooring there are fed. From there, it's going to the electricity grid. And this layer, layer 3, is most important to us because that defines the pricing mostly, because there is a single owner there. And then you can commingle or combine all the different terminals up to port authority level, and then you can do it on a national level. And then you have basically everything rolled up. Let me give an example because this can still be quite tricky. So we start with the layer 1, an OPS connection point. And if you have a closer look, you will see that I use the shore power project of Harriman and the Cullen Canal, because they have big plugs, as you can see on the satellite picture. But there we have 2 big ships, and they are connected via a single line, which is easier to see, and then with 2 plugs actually moored into the vessel. So that's layer 1, that's the single connection point. So we can have 2 ships connected into the layer 2, the substation or the E-house. So the maximum amount of power, the maximum amount of ships. If we know the single connection point, we just combine them into this is the maximum we can power from this particular station. And sometimes a little bit further down the road, no, on the other side, on the other side of the water, there's also a Stena line, and there you have, for example, that a single installation, 5 megawatts, top of my head, can power 1 ship 3 megawatts, another ship also 3 megawatts, but if there are more together, the maximum is 2.5 megs. So there could even be limitations in those different substations. Then we have the entire layer, the site, so that's at the Calland Canal. So in this case we have 1 substation, 2 connection points, that's it, but we could maybe have multiple. But that layer, that site, that's where price is defined, because the ship moored at that site needs to pay a specific price. Then we go to the entire Port of Rotterdam, so that's all the different shore power connections combined. And then of course every single shore power connection in the Netherlands find. So that's how we build up the database ourselves, and that's how we can also keep track of the technical, the regulatory and pricing stuff. And as you can see, we also included specific IDs so that we can always trace down or commingle or see that if we have a specific ID, everything else should follow through. Actually, this is not something you have to remember. What you have to remember is that prices live in layer 3, because that is a ship owner pays. They don't really care. They do care what's behind the meter, but that's at least where the transaction takes place. Which brings us to the second part, the pricing layer. We now know the problems. There is a fundamental regulatory push for more OPS use, especially in the EU. Technically there are challenges, but they can be solved almost always. So the key thing for developing a shore power project is costs, price. And because of the nature of the system, the transaction takes place when a ship is moored at the quayside and the ship pays per kilowatt hour or whatever kind of transaction they have going on. But almost always, I haven't heard the case where a ship gets free energy yet. Could be in specific places, but there's always a transaction, the physical transactions of kilowatt hours. We pay per the kilowatt hour. So let's dive into how much do ship owners pay, why, and how is it structured. From our database, we can see that there are more or less 3 price models. Actually, every single port does it differently. Port authority, I haven't seen, or terminal owners, I haven't seen a single one that really is the same. I guess there's always differences in 1 or 2 things, but if we model them, bringing down, we can say there are 3 different models. The first one is purely a volumetric. You just pay an amount per kilowatt hour. The second one is a fixed fee per call. So you pay per kilowatt hour, but you also pay additional fixed fees. And these are most used across the board, across the EU, but the amount of fixed fee and how it's done, that can be really different. Finally, you can also have a long-term contract, or actually a lease, or like a fee per year, plus additional cost for the electricity itself. So that is the different way of working with shore power. I actually personally prefer structure 3 the most, done and made that structure because of various reasons, but I do believe you can divide most of the risk between the shore and the ship, but that's not what this masterclass is about. So what do these 3 different structures mean? Purely volumetric, you just pay like you do at home. Just every kilowatt hour comes with a cost. Of course, this is mostly seen at lower voltage connection system, because then costs in general, not just for the infrastructure, but also running, maintaining, etc., are not that high. And it's simple and transparent at first glance. But of course, you have to remunerate some of the infrastructure capex, or at least the shore side. Then we have fixed fee per call, which is more or less the same, but we get additional fees per port call. We see this a lot in Scandinavia, weirdly enough, or almost all of them have this. Well, it's not really weird actually. You just have specific startup costs per port call, but also there we see different fees per call, as in first time you get here, there's a little extra work to be done, making sure that you can connect, etc. So then you pay more. In Marseille, we know that there's a different fee per call depending on, and also price per kilowatt hour depending on whether it's the winter or summertime, because of the local grid connections, etc. So this is one of the most used models. And then the long-term contract, and to be honest, the least used models, at least in the publicly available information that we see, but that's because long-term contracts for most ship owners are very, very tricky, especially if you do tramp sailing and not have a fixed port or place or call. But for typical specific offshore ships that always have the same port, or like emergency towing vehicles or port ships, tugs, they would definitely be benefited with that kind of contract. And if we have a look at the division, then we see that most of them, 56% of the total, is price per kilowatt hour. Mind you, there some deviations exist, and then almost everything else is fixed per call plus kilowatt hour. We just have a sliver of fixed per time. Actually, We have new information now, so the fixed per call is slightly bigger, eating away at the kilowatt hour only. I'd say in the publicly available information, it's about 50. Alright, that's it in terms of the models. This also will let you know that comparing these apples and pears and an orange in between, that's how you're going to do it. Ultimately, you can do it after the fact if you know the amount of kilowatt hours that has been consumed and the price people have paid. But for now, how do we compare them? There are multiple ways. So let's just start with saying the average price is hard, and I'll probably have said it and will do so a lot of times. But let's just put all or most of the prices that we found. We have some more, luckily. So in dark blue are the prices per kilowatt hours only, no additional fees, and in the lighter blue, the transparent one, we have prices upon which a fixed fee is added. So yeah, those are the lowest one, I believe some Malta and Portugal, and of course the other ones on the left hand side, a lot of them Scandinavia, by the way, because they have a better information feed. But from these selected few, you can see that probably the price of the transparent ones is always higher depending on your ship size. If you look into the data itself, it's typically discounted over the amount of kilowatt hours. It would probably be in the 5 to 10% max, but still these will typically go a bit higher. And so when we started this, and of course here we see that we do it per site level, so that's why Stockholm has just a lot of sites and terminals where shore power is used. But if we take this as our average price, then we see it is roughly 24 cents per kilowatt hour. Again, it's higher at the moment with the latest information, and it will change. It's continuously changing, but this is what we see now. So that's why not just the average is hard to give because different ways of measuring it, but also because it's constantly changing, not just with new information, but also with just frequent updates. There's another way of looking at it. If we compare it to the grid prices in the EU, we see that about, well, it's actually closer to 10, but most ports take the typical grid price roughly and add about 10 cents or a little bit more. So this is what we see these are the electricity prices per kilowatt hour in the EU, where the dark blue is just the bare electricity cost and the transparent blue is including taxes and non-recoverable costs, grid costs. So you see that the average price here, Finland lowest, well, that's really low, almost not even 10 cents per kilowatt hour, and the highest is Ireland, above 20. And we see that most port authorities, they just put a little extra on top, sometimes a port call fee, and that's about it. We did that analysis. It's a bit open-ended on the right-hand side, I see. Well, we don't have all countries done in that particular analysis. Not all of them have information available, and of course it's changing, but you can see the difference there. If you sum it up, it's hovering between 6 cents lowest to 19 cents in the Netherlands, but typically we see about 10 cents added upon the bare electricity costs. So that gives us a good indication of what one can expect, not just as a ship owner, but also as a port developer, project developer, terminal owner, on what you can ask. But that's not it, right? It's not just about the onshore part, it's also about the ship itself. I'll show you the tool later, not just the database, but we can automatically calculate the kilowatt hour range within which a ship is actually saving money and the operator is actually making money. But to do it, we first need to know how much it costs on board a ship to generate electricity. So let's have a look. If we take any ship, it's going to be different for any other ship. But bottom line, the basic way for ships to generate power on board is taking an auxiliary engine, or in the case of diesel electric, an engine. We put in fuel, we combust it, we put it in a generator, and the generator transforms that energy, that kinetic energy, into kilowatt hours. What do? We burn fuel in order to generate electricity. You could argue we did do the same on land with either coal, gas, or in some cases, some islands, they also have diesel generators. But that's how we make energy. And here we see the different years and the costs per kilowatt hours, in this case in dollars, and how much it would cost to burn a certain amount of fuel with associated regulatory costs in order to generate 1 kilowatt hour of energy. So what did we do? We took MDO, marine diesel oil. You could also take marine gas oil. Those are used mostly for generating electricity on board. We said, well, plenty of ways to look at it, but 180 grams per kilowatt hour is typically needed in order to make 1 kilowatt hour of energy. Actually, could be even more, but we have the model so you don't have to calculate it, but this is just one way of looking at it. And then on top of that fuel cost in gray, we have maintenance and consumable costs for the engines in light gray. We have EU ETS costs, so those are carbon taxes in the EU. Those are most likely to rise. On top of that, we have a FuelEU penalty. You will notice that FuelEU zigzags every 5 years. Why doesn't ours do it? Well, that's because it's very weird to discount the fuel consumed using shore power with the rest of the year. Or it's not weird, but shore power has inherent benefits under the FuelEU regulation, so that if you use shore power, actually all your sailing will also be benefited and improved. So the way we looked at it is to take a certain set of assumptions of how long the ship is at berth and how much it is sailing, and then compare the cases with and without FuelEU and shore power before and after, and take the difference there. The same applies to IMO if that ever is enacted. It's probably not going to be 2029, but it has a similar way of working, at least that we know now. So it could even be that, depending on how you look at it, the FuelEU and IMO cost will be a lot more actually. And this also doesn't take into account the FuelEU penalty. We'll discuss a little bit. But if we look at this, so for every year we just have bare fuel cost, associated maintenance, EU ETS, carbon tax, and then we have different regulations, and maybe at some point maybe more regulations, more costs, etc. The bare minimum of generating electricity on board, typically, historically, would be about 15 to 20 cents per kilowatt hour. 20 cents currently because the prices of fuel is quite high, but that is typically the range. And because of EU ETS and FuelEU, we're already approaching the 50, 60 dollar or euro cents per kilowatt hour. Could be even more once IMO kicks in ever, or if ETS prices really become a lot. This is the typical outlook. So when we look at the existing prices and how much it costs to burn fuel and generate electricity, there's already an opportunity for onshore developers. But let's have another look and just peel down the different layers, because not every ship has to deal with ETS, not every ship has to deal with FuelEU, and maybe no ships have to deal with IMO in the future. So let's break it and peel it down and see that this is the bare minimum that I was speaking of. That's the 20. Now, maintenance and spares and consumables, they don't do much. They do impact, especially if you have more engines, bigger engines, etc. Then it can be 20-25%, but for most ships it will not be that impactful. So we'll leave that for what it is, but this is typically how a ship owner looks at it. If you as a developer go to him or her and ask, do you want to pay shoreside electricity for 40 cents per kilowatt hour? It's probably going to say no, because that's more than what I typically pay for generating it on board, if they have to pay for it at all. So this is one of the reasons why it was always very hard to make a business case. FuelEU comes in and it's slightly higher every year, but it's already almost doubles it. So if you have a ship, or if you have a shore power infrastructure development project and you want to sell to those ships impacted by FuelEU. They don't have to comply per se, so it doesn't have to be container ships and passenger ships. If they are falling under the FuelEU regime, then it can already be of quite benefit for them. This actually excludes FuelEU OPS penalties. In clause, I believe 23.5 of FuelEU, you will find that if you have a ship, container ship or passenger ship, that is obliged to use shore power and it doesn't, it will have to pay 1.5 euros per kilowatt per hour while in port. So for a ship that has 1000 kilowatts installed, that's 1500 euros per hour. So That's a lot more. So I'm not even including those costs because then it's an absolute no-brainer. Apart from the fact that they have to, in order to comply and get the FuelEU document of compliance, that particular stick is a no. And then we have EU ETS, which is also expected to rise over the years, but has a less pronounced effect at the moment because of the benefits inherent to FuelEU. But of course, if those prices continue to increase, then it becomes, or at least the benefits of using shore power. As I stated, maintenance is just a little extra layer on the top, but here we took some, well, conservative estimates on the maintenance costs. Could be more, but it's typically not really in the scope of the ship owner, and this is how a ship owner looks at it. IMO, who knows? Perhaps it will be added, perhaps not. At this point in time, I'm not sure. What we can expect, however, over time, looking at 2030 beyond, prices will continue to increase. We've taken a constant price for fuel, constant price for maintenance. We pretty much know, well, we don't know what FuelEU and EU ETS is going to do, but that compliance part is easier to model than the pricing part of fuels. So it will be higher. It will be a lot higher at some point, especially if different countries will enact their own regimes. Which brings us to the fun part, the interactive database and references. Well, references aren't fun, but we have to show them to you in order for you to know where we get our information from. And the interactive database, absolutely, yeah, that one is fun. So all the information you see, we put it into a spreadsheet, pretty simple. There's API coverage if you need, but right now it's the key product is just a spreadsheet where we can easily keep track of the different locations, the prices and the references. And we use that in order to make a kilowatt hour prediction for your particular project. So, let me just show you the money. And here we have the OPS connections and prices database. Like I said, many times constantly being updated. We've also received some of your feedback already, which is greatly appreciated. And here we have the interactive map with some of the information not per port, but all of the different ports, as much as we have for some, or what is publicly available and can share. Mind you, could be that you are looking at the premium tool, which has less functionality, and all the numbers here are a bit fudged, because otherwise you can just simply copy and paste them. But rest assured that we keep track of all the different infrastructures, shore power infrastructures across the EU. And this is just another way of visualizing, and I like my visualizations and graphics. And this is what you've seen before, where the real money is. Well, we typically we have included some low voltage connection systems, but these work somewhat differently under the pricing schematics, and also because they are not obliged to use FuelEU and EU ETS in the future, we typically exclude them. So this is more or less the picture that you saw just now. And it automatically calculates the amount of ports, sites, OPS connections, etc. and average shore power price. We have the database behind it, so you could, for example, have a look and see what happens in Stockholm here, just to be, looking into what's close by, what are the prices that we know, etc., etc. So this is a way for us to give you easy access to the database. So now let me just show you the database itself. Here we have the instructions where you can read more about the methodology and actually go to the guide that I will show you afterwards that has all the information you need. The overview itself gives you a selection of what we just saw in the interactive tool, and also a selection of the different pricing models. We're using the freemium here because otherwise why buy the premium? But you can see that, well, what you just saw in the database, that is basically what we do. We make overviews of the data and make that available to you. We'll start at 3 because the OPS points and the substations are now being filled, and that's not always as easy as it may look. But rest assured that here we have all the different connection points, and with them all the different data points that we have, plus a confidentiality level, plus also the sources where we took those particular points from. So that's pretty important. The ones that do not have a hyperlink, those are in our system as PF, etc. So for each line item, we have a certain degree of confidence because of that source, what we have done in order to state that this information is in fact correct. And this is the freemium one, so it has less functionality, but that's unfortunately all I can do at the moment to show you publicly. And there At the port level, we commingle all the port information, and at the country level, we commingle country information in order to get easier overviews for you. And basically, that is it. And how we use all that information is to just make a business case, meaning what would be the required kilowatt hour price for ship and shore for your project. So here we have, very quickly and briefly, container ship terminal. And as you can see, we automatically calculate the price at which the ship breaks even in a particular year or after 7 years, and the price at which the shore side has to sell electricity in order to be break even. Everything here is included in the sense that, you know, if prices are increased, that of course would impact the shore side business case and everything here. Let's see, the kilowatt hour price of course is the one that we want to know. So if we have a cost price, we can see that of course the lower the cost we pay for electricity, buy electricity and we sell it to the ship, so the lower the better. And if we have an electricity price, let's see, 30 cents per kilowatt hour, that's just about break even in that 7 years we need. So actually it needs to be a little bit closer in order to break even. We already know that, but if we dip below 11 cents, then we are beyond that 7 years of payback rate. So this is how we not just use the information to get an idea and an estimate of the required or actual prices paid per kilowatt hour for the ship, but also what we need at the shore side in order to make a profit. If you go back to the website, there we see the database again. If you scroll down, you can also see the database methodology and guide. You can also download it, and if you do it, then you will find that all the references, starting at the pricing models, nice. This is the guide. This is actually what I've just told you. There you can find the model itself and references here. There you can see the references used. Of course, in the freemium version, we do not make them public. That is, you can find these all yourselves. But if you're a member, you get the following: access to all the different port tariffs and information you need. Some of course already in the database, but if you want them, you can have them here. So all the references here, plus some extra port tariffs, and anything we find now and in the future is available for members. So if you want to have it, if you need more, just sign up to the hub for all the premium features, the downloads and the support that you might need. Not just to get pricing estimates, but all the models to make a business case for shore power project. Thanks for watching the video and have a great day.